Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Lone. Welcome to the European E-commerce Week webinar. Today, we're going to be focusing on European e-commerce after our most recent publication, about 3 or so months ago, of the European e-commerce report. We want to check in and see how European e-commerce is doing. And we're going to be doing that today with some sponsor and industry experts. We've got Juliette Bulleton from E-commerce Europe. And we've got Jesse Ragg from Ecomelion. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. You can correct me. He's the co-founder and managing director. By the way, Juliet is the consultant of EU Public Affairs. We're also going to be joined after we're done talking today, because we're hanging out live, but after we're done talking today, we've also got another person who I had a conversation with earlier on in the week, Lindsay McEwen. He's the general manager of the EMEA at Telium. So we've got a lot to say about data and how that works with e-commerce. So be sure that after you watch us live and during the presentation, after that, you're going to be hearing some good stuff from him. So stay tuned. Okay, we've got a brief presentation for you about European e-commerce. I'm going to quit looking at my notes and actually look at the screen so that we can hang out. These are our panelists, of course. As I said, Lindsay will be joining later, so stay tuned for that. If you have any questions, you can reach out to these guys directly. Okay, so first I wanted to cover just some basics about the European e-commerce market. I think it's a bit important to set up this webinar in that way. So we've got the e-commerce infrastructure and B2C market sizes. When we're looking at Europe, it's important, of course, to see the population. I thought maybe this would be relevant for everybody. Of course, if we look at a comparison to the United States, they have 330 million people. Europe is pretty large, but yeah. And then when it comes to internet use, 87% we're forecasting for 2020 will be using the internet. This is all really great data you can find from Eurostat. When it comes to the amount of people shopping online, or the share of the online users who are shopping online, we're forecasting that in 2020, 68% of online users will be shopping online. Now, we started doing some data collection before COVID really hit hard in Europe, so it's my Sarah guess that that will be a bit higher, but we'll have to see in 2021 when you all check out the report then. Some other interesting bits, I'm going to show you on the next slide the B2C e-commerce turnover, but just first the eGDP, which is the share of GDP that is made up by e-commerce for all of Europe. We're forecasting that to be around 5.16%, so that's a pretty good chunk. It could be bigger, but that's a pretty good chunk still. So this is the money slide, like I like to call it. This is B2C e-commerce turnover and growth rate. This is all in billions of euros, so we did all the currency conversions where possible. The European report covered over 34 countries, so it's a pretty good snapshot of Europe as a whole. We're forecasting, and a lot of these figures actually do take into consideration COVID-19. We work with the e-commerce associations that are members of Ecommerce Europe to come to this number. And we're looking at 2020 to be around 717 billion euros. So it's a really, really sizable market. It's definitely a big player when it comes to e-commerce. And as you can see, the growth trend is that it's still in the positive growth rates, slowing down a little bit, but it's still growing at a really decent rate. So I just wanted to cover also by region what that looks like, because you know, we can talk about Europe, but Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, Western Europe, they're all a bit different. As you can see, they're actually very, very different. In fact, Western Europe is the leader when it comes to B2C e-commerce turnover. Western and Northern Europe lead with internet users and e-shoppers, of course. And you can see Eastern Europe is struggling a bit with e-shoppers, though they are growing. Looking at B2C e-commerce turnover, Western Europe has actually, I'll just scroll this way, you can see 70% of the total turnover in 2019 was in Western Europe, followed by Southern Europe. And this could be just the amount of countries that they have, but typically this is due to the United Kingdom, where most of my lovely team is based out of. They had over 200 billion euros in turnover for 2019. So I'll just pop back really quickly to this slide to show you what the turnover was for Northern, Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. If you look at Eastern Europe, a lot of that has to do with currency differences. So Eastern Europe is on the rise, though. And then, of course, this slide. Okay, so I just, let's see, also wanted to tell you about B2C e-commerce turnover growth rate in 2019. So I just showed everybody, and I think it'll be really, really interesting actually to get our panelists' opinion on this, for where they're also seeing growth in their markets. You can see on that second graph there that the real growers in the market are in Eastern Europe. So we've got Romania, we've got Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Ukraine as well is up there. These markets are growing very quickly. If you look at the United Kingdom, for example, in comparison, as you can see, it's somewhere down the list here, 15%. So a lot of the countries that are pretty mature have plateaued between 12 and 15, 16% growth rates, whereas the countries that are on the rise are really, really heading it up. And I think COVID is going to have a positive impact. I don't want to say a positive impact, but I think it's gonna, for e-commerce, it's doing some good things. Okay, so I just wanted to, the elephant in the room, talk about COVID-19 and European e-commerce. And I'm gonna ask Jessie some questions about this. In France, retailers have definitely showed some changes. This is data that actually the French e-commerce association FEVAD collected in March. I know it's a bit late now, but it's important to see how coronavirus has impacted retail, because there are some trends that we're actually assuming will continue on. So one of the issues with supply chain issues, we're noticing that consumers have said maybe they're more likely to buy local, even continuing to buy more local, because they're a bit concerned about those supply chain issues. And then, of course, there were a lot of disruptions with activities, but it's getting better, and maybe our panelists can talk a bit about that. And then I wanted to just show you the other side of it, because a lot of times we focus on the really big markets with the UK, France, Germany, but this is a growing market. Romania, they've also had quite some issues. And as you can see now, the payment methods that are being used by consumers before and after have drastically changed. One of the trends that we notice in Eastern Europe is that cash on delivery is still sort of king. There are some trust and security concerns, and again, I look forward to talking with you both about that. But so that's why it's kind of interesting to see now that cash has decreased quite substantially, and of course we can assume that's due to COVID. And then the frequency for shopping online, of online payments. So I think these are some really interesting figures for you to know. Do you guys have any thoughts on the data that I just showed? I know it was a little bit quick, but maybe Juliet, we can start with you. I would start as e-commerce Europe. Maybe you have some thoughts on the data that I just showed and where the markets are going. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts first.
Thanks a lot, Sarah, and thank you for having me today, reflecting on this and also looking a bit in the future, because I think we've been so stuck in our daily impact and daily life that it's refreshing sometimes to also look at what's next. So looking forward to talk to that. In terms of reaction, I mean, of course, we're very much looking forward to see the results of next year, because we're sort of working under the assumption, that things have slowly gone back to normal, but not that much. And I think for me, if I can take two examples of what I think is striking and I could reflect on is, for example, the last slide on evolution of payment methods, because I think what we've reflected on since the publication of the report is how long-term trends somehow evolved and grew a lot faster than we would have anticipated before. So, for example, digitalization of payments, cash on delivery, those are long-term fading trends. And now we see that basically because of consumers' trust is changing, there's a larger acceptance of digital sales and digital payments, then we can see that this is actually changing quite fast. And yeah, interesting to see if it's going to stick around or evolve again once we go back to normal.
Yeah, definitely. I very much agree. And Jessie, do you want to give us some of your thoughts as well on the data? I mean, specifically, maybe it's kind of interesting now. I think everybody knows a bit about what e-commerce Europe does. That's pretty obvious at this point. But maybe it's a bit interesting to hear exactly what Ecommerce does, and also how that relates to what you just saw in the data and what you're experiencing right now from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I definitely don't want to turn this into a sales pitch. This isn't a conversation about Ecommerce, but I guess just for perspective, we're a software which works in the space of e-commerce marketplaces. So what we do is we make it a lot easier for brands and retailers selling products on marketplaces to actually do so, because Amazon, everyone knows how to sell on Amazon if they're selling on marketplaces. But as soon as you want to expand beyond Amazon or become a little bit less reliant on it, it's a whole different ballgame. And what we try to do is make it a lot easier to expand into other channels. So, you mentioned France. Cdiscount is a great example. And I think, you mentioned that French consumers particularly are looking at going down the road of buying more locally. And a great example of that already pre-COVID was Cdiscount. For a number of years, it's been the second major marketplace in France. It's way above eBay, which most other countries is a major player. But, I think last time I looked at a report, I think from Statista, eBay was number 7 on the list and Cdiscount was number 2. And, this is something that's continually growing. And I think that speaks very true to the fact that French consumers like to buy from French businesses. And so I think what you see is, when you have something like COVID come along and you have a French business jump up and down, go, hey, you know what, we're going to build a marketplace specifically to get to buy PPE and make it nice and cost effective for French medical, for hospitals, for doctors, for nurses, for everyone that needs it to get access to this, because this is our level of experience. And they partnered with Miracle to do this. And you had this great French marketplace that popped up, and I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but maybe we can find a link to share later. Yeah. But it's a great example of some COVID-inspired innovation combined with a French motivation to buy locally and support local businesses. And this was a really nice result. And again, with Romania, something just to give an example on that, because it's a country not a lot of people give a lot of credit to, but it does have a burgeoning e-commerce scene, and I think COVID has given it a little bit of a kick in this direction, as your numbers were already showing. But eMag is a great marketplace there, which is actually prominent in most of those countries, but it's very prominent in Romania. And what they actually do is, they address the fact that last mile, the sort of getting your products to Romania is one thing, but dealing with logistics, dealing with the language, dealing with cash on delivery and returns, and how do you handle all of this stuff? eMag have gone, well, we know this is a problem. We're not going to get international sellers on our marketplace if we can't deal with this. So they've gone and they've got a program, they've called it FBE, not FBA. They've called it FBE, Fulfillment by eMag. But what they do is it's very similar to Amazon's FBA. You store your items in their warehouse in Romania, and they take care of everything from that point. So all you have to do is give them the products that you want to sell, and they help you figure out which ones are going to be good. And then they take care of everything. And so you've got companies like this, which do make it easy. And, they basically introduced Black Friday to Romania about 10 years ago. So before e-commerce was even really a thing there, but they are kind of bringing these sort of modern examples of commerce into these countries, which, are less willing to adopt such things.
Yeah, definitely. And the data shows that. It's so funny because as you're talking, I'm writing down all these random ideas that you make me think of. And the questionnaire that I was going to ask is now totally out the window. And no, but so you already brought up Amazon and marketplaces. And I noticed, just staying with the COVID theme, and probably Juliet, you also maybe noticed this. This is a totally random question, but I feel like any brick and mortar retailer who was once just brick and mortar with COVID, all of a sudden went, okay, I really need to get online. And I don't have all the figures for how many new retailers we are seeing online, but I do think that the one of the main entry points that they tend to use is a marketplace, and knowing which marketplace to try that market entry strategy on or which one to join has been interesting. Do you feel like you've seen the same thing, Juliet, from maybe members or from member associations?
I think it's interesting because for a long time when I started and we were talking about omni-channel, we were almost only talking about pure players bringing like brick and mortar shops. And now the conversation completely shifted to exactly what you mentioned. I have to admit, this is really something we would be interested in looking into, because I wouldn't be able to tell, how merchants, brick and mortar, have made the decision to go online. How do you choose the marketplace that fits the best for you? I know there was a lot of last minute development and sort of using stores as, your logistics centers, basically, and sort of like trying to manage the changes, and still trying to maintain the resource that you have and the infrastructure that you have, and continue to operate. But we don't have a lot of clarity, I think, yet, and that's something we need to look into, on how the digital landscape has been impacted, and how the repartition between online, offline, omnichannel has been impacted by COVID. I think we'll need a couple more months to really see the impact of this as well.
Yeah, for sure. I wonder if, Jessie, do you have an answer to her question, maybe? How many new... I'm not going to put that on you, but...
No, to be honest, I'd love to know, because I'd love to talk to them all. But no, the reality of it is that and the thing that interests me the most is you've got businesses who have sworn for years off of Amazon. There's a real love-hate relationship with anyone selling on Amazon, or looking at Amazon, or looking at any kind of online, really, particularly with more traditional sort of 50-plus-year-old businesses, where they go, no, online. Some of them, especially here in Germany, a lot of them go, oh no, it's just a phase. And even the ones that are more willing to admit that online sales is a thing for the long term, a lot of them will be very anti-marketplace or very anti-Amazon, and it depends a little bit on if it's perhaps a high street retailer who maybe sees Amazon as kind of the enemy. Mm-hmm. And maybe they're what's going to kill the future of their business from their perspective, and they're a little bit hesitant to go on there. But there's also a big difference between if it's a brand or if it's a retailer, because many retailers who they sell hundreds of products from hundreds of brands on as many different sales channels as they can, and online's always been one of those. But I think the really interesting shift, which was happening pre-COVID, but COVID sort of really lit a fire under it, is brands actually going direct to consumer and using marketplaces as a bit of a catalyst for this. And I think there's a couple of elements to it where you've got retailers somewhat shaking in their boots, going, well, are we going to be undercut? Are we going to get cut out of the process here, and no longer have access to good prices, because these savings are just going to get passed straight on to the consumer? But you also see a lot of brands going, well, you know what? We don't like the way that our products are being advertised online, because maybe we spent weeks figuring out the perfect way to advertise this one particular pair of shoes, but it doesn't match with what Amazon says you're allowed to list a product as. So a retailer somewhere in the process has chopped the end off the title, or maybe used a different word to describe it, whatever it might be. But the brands are coming in and going, well, that's not our product anymore. Yeah. So let's regain that control. And this was something that was starting to happen pre-COVID, but now you've suddenly got all these brands going, well, hang on, our retailers aren't buying our products anymore because they're not selling them themselves in their shops. We've cancelled entire seasons that were already in production. We've got to somehow get these products out there. How are we going to do it ourselves? And they're jumping onto marketplaces in particular, because it is an easy way to get into new sales channels. But they're also really just doubling down their efforts on direct consumer themselves. And I think that's a whole nother topic, but it's definitely another trend that COVID has sparked.
Yeah, for sure. And Juliet, I can see you shaking your head yes as well. I think we're all in quite agreement with some of these things. I'm wondering, to keep it, before I get yelled at by somebody watching the webinar, to keep it EU focused, what are you noticing when it comes to the conversation around marketplaces and brands and retailers in Europe? And is there a country, this is a totally random question, so if you're like, I don't want to answer that, that's also mine. But what are you noticing when it comes to, what e-commerce associations maybe are doing and saying, and what their retailers are looking for, and how they're working around this?
You mean in terms of the role of marketplaces in developing? I think the interesting thing is that when we talk about the landscape of e-commerce as an association, as a European association, you get very different insights from each country, because not every country has the same relationship to marketplaces. Some of them have, local marketplaces, some of them have not. I think it's interesting to see that it's not sort of an EU-wide or uniform sort of approach to it, and there's still a lot of national differences when it comes to how we shop online, how, as you mentioned, how brands decide to put themselves on the market, and so on. Whether it has to do with consumer habits, whether it has to do with implementation of certain actors. Yeah, I think there's a lot of factor going in, so I'm gonna leave it at that.
Yeah, okay, we'll put a pin on that specific one and just come away from that with knowing there is no one-size-fits-all approach to a European consumer. The European consumer doesn't exist. You have to really look at local differences. And with that in mind, actually, Jesse, you brought up the last mile already, and I'm curious because I know sustainability is also a topic that is very different depending on which European country you are looking to sell into, for what consumers want, et cetera. So maybe, Juliet, if you can talk a little bit about maybe what you're doing towards sustainability, or what the status is for Europe, because I think retailers listening might want to know, what do I do? Do I market myself as sustainable? Do I not? And then Jesse, I want to get to you also on this when it comes to market. So go ahead.
Thanks. So I think it's interesting. So I'll jump directly on the consumer part. But then I think I could talk for hours when it comes to sustainability and e-commerce, because it's sort of what I was mentioning at the beginning, sort of the bright side and the thing we're looking forward to see develop. But basically, consumers is a key aspect, because you can't develop a sustainable market if you don't have a demand for it. And I think it's always kind of a balancing act, because consumers, are they ready to pay more? We don't know. If you ask them, they most likely say yes, but in practice, we don't really have a clue of how, because I think the most important thing for consumer will stay, the price quality ratio. So they're ready to put in more, but they also expect more. So I think it's always sort of a joint effort on both sides. And I think the interesting thing when it comes to consumer, and maybe the differences between one market to another, is we have a lot of discussion about information. How much and what kind of information do you have to give to consumers for them to have, the right tools to make an informed decision? And of course, this is a very tricky topic, because you could give like a list of 20,000, environmental criteria to a product, that's just going to end up losing the consumer and not necessarily creating trust, not necessarily creating, this kind of like, oh, okay, I know what I'm getting into, and I feel like I'm making the choice that I'm willing to make. So I think it's this is sort of the discussion we have right now at European level and between different markets. So how do we tailor the offer? How do we tailor the information? How do we make it trustworthy and simple to understand to consumers as well? And also, of course, as a retailer, the information you give is dependent on the products you have, so the producers. And most of the efforts that the e-commerce industry is putting in sustainability is also, behind the door. So it's not just what the consumer see and buys, but it's also, how do we deliver your product? How do we package them? What do we do with the products when you return them? So I think it's it's a very big discussion. Consumers are central and yet small parts of the big picture that we see happening in terms of retailers cooperating with their service provider to really have an overall impact on the transition to a sustainable economy. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think it's going to be, for retailers, there's in my opinion, there's two aspects to it. So of course, market yourself as much as possible. Try to build on the effort you put in, because most retailers in Europe right now are putting as much effort as they can to develop sustainable solutions and practices. And of course, this matters not only towards consumer, but also towards policymakers, because what we want is, if you want a sustainable practices to go cross-border and to grow, you need frameworks that actually allows that. And I think something that we really have at heart in e-commerce Europe is that sometimes the discussion on e-commerce and sustainability is a bit biased, I would say, or at least there's a lot of myth around the impact of e-commerce on sustainability that are not always easy to detangle and really go back to the facts of the impact of the industry and the sector. So I think it's really important for retailers to sort of showcase. So be open about what you do, your practices. I think it's going to be useful down the road to an extent we can't even imagine right now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, that's really good to know. And I think, Jesse, because you also brought up Okay, so again, I'm taking away from this, there's no one size fits all consumer. And I think, Jesse, you already talked about that with the marketplaces part of it. And also I know from what your tools can do to understand consumers better, to reach them better. How can you sort of marry, let's say, what you do with the topic of sustainability maybe, and reaching consumers and ensuring that retailers are able to reach the consumers that they need? So like a targeting marketing thing. I don't know.
I think sustainability in e-commerce is a bit of a tough topic anyway, because by definition, sustainability and consumerism are kind of conflicting statements. You can't really have one without the other, or one with the other. To be honest, I think e-commerce is kind of the savior on that regard, because you have an opportunity with e-commerce and with marketplaces, or with sort of more traditional sort of B2C e-commerce through direct sales websites and everything. You suddenly have an opportunity where supply and demand become a lot more closely matched. You're not having products produced unnecessarily. You start technology's moving towards a place where you can actually produce on demand. You have a number of apparel companies that do print on demand, that you can have your own t-shirts designed and printed as and when you order it. So you're not having waste products created there. And I think it is moving in the right direction. Sustainability is personally one of my driving factors for eChameleon. I'm not a massive, I'll put it out there now, I'm not a massive fan of Amazon personally. It doesn't match, the ethics don't match how they operate as a business, don't match my own personal ethics. And one of my biggest drivers is making it easy for small and medium-sized retailers and brands to compete on the same level as big players, and to do so without becoming reliant on Amazon. Because you have most of them, and traditionally in the last 10 years or so, most small and medium-sized retailers get to the point where they're competing against the Nikes and Amazons and Pumas, as in they're selling on the same playing field. They're all on the same channels, they're all online. The problem is that then they suddenly find themselves in a position where 80 or 90% of their revenue is coming from one channel. And then if they make one mistake, maybe they miss a customer service email or whatever, Amazon comes on and goes, hey guys, you're not allowed to sell here anymore. That's it. Business is closed. Employees lose their jobs. You've got people out of work, and it's a horrible situation. Obviously, the key to that is to diversify. And obviously, Amazon is the big marketplace. You've got to be on there. You've got to be selling on there. But if you can sort of not put all your eggs in one basket, start. If you're selling in France, look at the other French marketplaces. Look at Cdiscount, which we spoke about. Look at Fnac. Look at Price Mania. There's so many marketplaces in France, depending on the type of product that you're selling. And you don't always have to sell on the big two, on Amazon and eBay or Walmart in the US. It makes sense to be on there, if for nothing else than brand presence. You're here, you're there. A consumer generally will shop around, and if they find a product that matches what they want, they're going to go and look on the other 2 or 3 sites and see how much it costs there. And if you can help drive traffic towards the other sites that aren't Amazon, then that's fantastic. But the thing is, you've got other great marketplaces that are popping up all over the place, all with the same goal of taking on Amazon. OnBuy in the UK is a fantastic example. They're doing a brilliant job. They're growing really quickly. They're getting on new sellers, and it's an attractive place for a consumer to go and look for a product if that consumer doesn't want to buy on Amazon. And I think that's the best thing that a retailer can be doing these days in the sustainability aspect, from an online perspective. Obviously, in the production line and down the supply chain, there's a number of other factors you can do. But when it comes to marketplaces and online sales channels, looking for the other marketplaces to sell on that aren't Amazon, that aren't eBay, so you can actually diversify and do so in a way that's still cost effective. That's where we come in, of course, but this is really the step that makes it easy to say, yeah, okay, I'm here and I'm supporting these other small marketplaces with my business as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that maybe makes it a bit more difficult for consumers, or not consumers, sorry, retailers, is that Amazon offers so many options for them to reach their consumers and quickly and whatnot. And so it does make me wonder, what is the future? Keeping all this in mind, right? Because with COVID, and we know that there are SMEs who are struggling out there, and with sustainability and with competition and wanting to make sure that they're there and they're on the marketplaces. maybe I'll go with Juliet first. What do you see as the future of European e-commerce as a whole? I mean, that's taking all these things into consideration, right? And it's a big question, but consumers are behaving differently than they have ever before right now, just right now. Maybe it's for the future, maybe it's, we don't know. They're expecting different things. Where is the future of that going in light of COVID and the sustainability conversations and, oh my God, the US election. Sorry. And then I want to also hear
Brexit, everything.
Yeah.
I think it's a wide topic. I think I'm actually going to go back to something I said at the beginning. That something that was quite striking in our conversation throughout the summer was how much COVID sort of unexpectedly made some of the evolution a lot faster than we would ever anticipate. But I think it's, I can't talk about necessarily, how SMEs are going to be able to recover and so on, but I do see that the conversation at least focuses a lot on how do we recover more by digitalizing and how do we recover by investing in sustainability. I think the big problem right now is that the question of investment and developing your business, everything is sort of on hold. So it's very difficult, I think, and I can't speak for them because I'm not a retailer personally, but I can imagine it's very difficult at the moment to make long-lasting choices on your investment and how you conduct your business. However, we do see, and you mentioned, how consumers are, suddenly changing a bit faster than they used to, and we always used to portray e-commerce as a place where changes happen in a month, but it's even crazier now. I do think that there's going to be some necessary evolution to some extent. So sustainability for sure, but I think payments is also an interesting aspect of it. That there's there is a fatigue of certain, for retailers like cross-border payments, being able to offer the best seamless experience to consumers, and this is going to require more and more investment in new payment solution, in new technologies. So I think there's going to be sort of a need to embrace new technologies and new payment solutions. That's going to be, unfortunately, an investment, or fortunately, because that's also an opportunity to attract new consumers. But that's going to be the sort of investment that retailers is going to have to look at. And of course, well, I'm not going to dive too much into it, but it's something that marketplaces also offer. That's, for example, access to authentication methods and so on. That's, a small company and small business doesn't necessarily know how to navigate just now. So, there's going to be education needed, investments, reaching new consumers. Yeah, it's just a lot, I think, to take on. But for sure, all the trends that we've seen before, I mean, omnichannel exploding, seamless payment exploding, conscious buyers, not only sustainability, but also beyond, price consciousness and so on. Everything has been, going so fast that I think it's going to really have a very long-lasting effect on the industry for sure. And maybe just to finish, we haven't quite seen yet, the impact on the sector itself financially. So, of course, some of the sectors are doing very well, like IT and, and so on. Other sectors will have to maybe rethink the way they do business in the future. And I think, Jesse, you mentioned, the demand-driven kind of aspect of e-commerce. And I think this is going to be also something that will, be very relevant for the future as well.
Yeah, it's perfect as an answer to say that it's a bit uncertain, but definitely we're all investing more into e-commerce. And I think you mentioned a few things: digitalization, investing in sustainability, new technology. And I was thinking about you, Jesse. That was such a Dutch way of saying it, Jesse. That customers really, especially in mature markets, they seem to really want everything at their fingertips. And I'm curious. I think COVID is having also an impact on way that people want to receive information. So consumers in particular want to know how much of stock somebody has, and specifically what the product specifications are and whatnot. And so I do wonder how they can combat, of course, with marketplaces, or how they can integrate into them to really give everything that the consumers are now looking for, which is all the different payment methods, cross-border they want to have. They want to know how many it is, how big it is, all the product specifications. And do you think that's going to be coming more with COVID, that's going to be a new thing, that everybody wants every piece of information? And
it's funny because, and this also relates a little bit back to the sustainability topic, and it's a bit of a long-winded way to get there, and I'll try and make it as concise as I can. But something that Germans, for example, are really, really renowned for in e-commerce is returns. Anyone that's ever sold from, if you've started in the UK and then you've gone to Germany just thinking, oh, cool, I'm getting all these sales. Look, this guy just bought 4 pairs of shoes. And then you get 3 of them back. And he kept the one that fit, but he sent the other 3 back. Now, that's true in every country. But the thing is, and Amazon has really driven forward the demand for next day delivery, and with that then also the expectation of quick returns, and this is something that the industry as a whole has had to adopt to because of just the impact of things like Amazon Prime. Now, if you've got a seller that is not able to accurately display their sizing chart or exactly what the product is that they're selling, and a consumer maybe buys it anyway, but with a 50-50 shot on if it's actually the right thing for them, but they think, hey, you know what, I'm just going to buy it because it's maybe right, but I'll send it back if not. That I'll send it back attitude is probably one of the worst parts of sustainability in e-commerce, or lack thereof. And this is, again, another reason why I think retailers, or anyone selling online in general, really needs to improve the process to actually display that information as much as possible. Second only to the fact that buyers actually want this information. If you look at the amount of filters that are available on any category, on any subcategory, you can filter by everything. You can filter, if you're on shoes, you can filter by the inner material, the outer material. I mean, maybe it's just because I'm a bloke, I search blue or something and I'm happy, but there's definitely people out there that want to apply such granular levels of filters when they're buying a product. And the problem is that if you've not supplied that information, again, to use marketplaces as an example, because they've got the most complex and comprehensive lists of sort of attributes or item specifics that you can give about a product. As soon as you have a blank space in that field, you just fall out of the search results. So you could have the perfect product, exactly what that buyer is looking for, but if you haven't filled in the item specifics that are actually relevant to that product, if the buyer then starts applying filters to look for exactly what you're selling, you're not going to show up in the result. And that's obviously bad because it is something that's going to hamper sales. And depending on the channel that you're then selling on, maybe you know how to do this for Amazon, but you then have to do it again completely differently for eBay, completely differently for Cdiscount, completely differently for Walmart, etc., etc., etc. It does become a time investment for a lot of people to do that, and then they say, "Oh, well, I don't get the sales on this channel, so it's not worth investing the time." And then it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is something that we try to make a bit easier, but it's something that, if you do properly, it has massive returns. Investing the time in actually doing that is proven on so many levels. There's so many cases out there of people doing that properly and reaping the rewards from it.
Yeah, it's I think anything that can help retailers sell anywhere, but definitely in Europe, because I do feel like some of the markets are fairly saturated. So you really need to be spot on. Absolutely. If you want to really reach your consumers. That's really good. And it does kind of harken back to what Juliette said, because you had said earlier that consumers also need some education when it comes to sustainability. Not in like a patronizing way, but in a very much like, they just need to know what is the actual cost of a return if you're going to on the environment. That's super important.
I think for me that's a tricky part, because as I mentioned earlier, consumer information is key. So but education also, because in the end the consumer makes the choice. No matter how many piece of information you give them, they're still the one making the choice in the end. So not only does there needs to be the right and proper information given to them, but education beyond that. Because, for example, you could have as much information as possible and people still returning too much items. So I think it's always needs to be a bit of both, and not taking away the agency of consumers as well in making the choice they want. But for sure, I think it's going to be, we have to probably improve the way you present information, the way retailers are able to provide this information, as Jesse mentioned. And hopefully we can see that this can have an impact lasting longer than just, one consumer, and really change the way we also consider e-commerce and shopping online and so on. Because it's also, I'll finish on that, but something interesting that members in Germany pointed out is that because of the evolution of what people were buying during confinement, they actually saw returns sort of dropping, because people were buying more, like furniture, IT equipment, and those are less likely to be returned than, for example, fashion and so on. And also maybe there was an aspect to it of like more, as I mentioned, more conscious buying. So you have a different relationship to what's in your home, to your space. So maybe you make different choices when you buy online, and less likely, to risk a trip to the post office, for example. So there's a lot of variables and a big role for consumers to play. And if retailers can facilitate that as much as possible, that's the way to go, I guess.
Yeah, it's so funny to have, e-commerce here at the macro level around European e-commerce, and then you have Jesse's perspective, which is really applied. It's really like, this is how you sell on a marketplace effectively. And then there's also the European e-commerce report, which you need if you're gonna, okay, that was my shameless plug. I don't know how much time has passed, but I'm having a good time. So until that by somebody, I'm gonna keep going. So, okay, no, I think if from my takeaway here is so far that there is no one-size-fits-all European consumer. There are a lot of changes that are happening from COVID, and those changes are having also a massive impact in relationship to sustainability as well. We're seeing some trends with local shopping. Elderly consumers are also more likely to shop online. So there are definitely some European trends that we're seeing. My one last question, because I'm going to get yelled at eventually, is maybe Juliet, if you can just highlight, I don't know if there's any upcoming or current policies or something like that is having a positive or a negative impact on. So I'm going to give you this question, and then I'm going to give Jesse one. So for Juliet, it's, what are you seeing for policy-wise that's going to have a positive or a negative impact on e-commerce, and particularly for retailers wanting to sell into Europe? And then for Jesse, I would say, if you can think about this while Juliet's answering, is what are maybe 3 pieces of really important advice that you would give to a retailer who wants to is already in Europe and wants to expand into another European country, and I mean right now, in light of COVID and sustainability, or from outside of Europe who wants to sell into Europe and they just need, okay, but what is it, the most important applied information that I need to have? And that's kind of curveball, so you can think about that, and Julia probably has all the information already in her mind.
Thanks, Sarah. So it's I made a shocked face, but it's also because it's been so busy in Brussels. So there's so many legislation coming up that will impact e-commerce that in my head I was like, where do I start?
Yeah, and I started Jesse. Jesse left. Oh, he's back. Okay.
He got scared by the amount of legislation that I was about to. Now, this is probably. EU regulation is both fascinating and extremely boring. So I think I'll just mention some themes. And Sarah, you mentioned, like if you want to get in depth of what we work on and so on, you have our email address, so you can also reach out directly to the association. But I think just to mention some of the big things that we think will impact the sector. Lots of legislation on sustainability. So new requirements for the information you display, how you display it. There's going to be new rules on packaging that are coming up that could impact, the way you actually package your product, because the Commission wants to reduce what they call overpackaging, and e-commerce is one of the sectors in which they want to see some positive development in the future. So sustainability for sure. Promoting a lot circular economy. So if you're active in the second-hand market, there's definitely an opportunity for you to get interested in EU policy. Lots of things happening in payments as well. Now, basically what we see is that we're sort of, the European Commission is trying to redefine what's the payments of the future. And I think merchants are too often missing from this conversation because we're just the end users. But the voice of merchants matters so much when it comes to what payment methods are available in Europe. So there's also another topic that I definitely advise interested merchants to look out for. And then, there's going to be a lot of legislation on platforms and their relationship to consumers and retailers. So yeah, this is my colleague's dossier, but for sure the Digital Services Act, if you haven't heard about it, I think it's very much interesting to look into, and how it's going to change the internet, some people say. So that's a big program. And also, consumer law, lots of development as well, because the Commission is learning from the COVID crisis and trying to update their approach. Taxation, I mean, it's just, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to scare anyone here, but just to say that basically there's a lot. So I think because of the crisis, there's sort of a realization that we need to, move things along and have a recovery that's structured and framed and so on. So there's definitely 3 hours worth of topics to mention, but I think, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Next webinar for sure. Gritty of policy. Okay, Jesse, did you come up with some good pieces of advice for for retailers?
Yes and no. I wanted to ask a counter question, because you asked about people selling into Europe. Are you talking about people from, for example, within Europe, or European businesses selling within Europe, or people from, for example, the US or the UK coming into Europe? What's your perspective there? Because it's very different tips.
We didn't even talk about Brexit. We failed, guys.
No, it's old news.
That's true.
As a Brit living in Germany, let's not talk about Brexit.
Okay. I would say retailers coming from outside the EU, as in, yeah, the UK, the US, Canada, China as well, and then retailers, let's say from France, who want to sell into Germany, for example.
Okay, so I think the biggest tip probably comes nicely off the back of what Juliette was saying. There's so many different laws. You've basically got 27 countries all making their own laws, and having to somehow combine this all to make the block laws and make sure that they're not contradicting with each other. And obviously, one of the major things that comes into the part of that is the different cultures. And I think that's one thing to be really, really careful of, is when we said already a few times, there is no European consumer. And when you are coming into Europe from outside, you need to think about whereabouts are you going, not just which country, but also which marketplace or which sales channel, what category, how you're selling to an electronics consumer on an electronics specified marketplace in France is completely different to how you're going to be selling to an apparel purchaser in Germany or in Italy, for example. So I think you need to really, really, really consider your end user. And this applies to whether you're a brand who's saying, hey, I want to find a local distributor in that country. You can then find one who knows how to communicate that message properly. Or if you want to go direct to consumer, then you need to figure out what the right sales channels are going to be. And again, Amazon, fine, it's sort of everywhere, and it's an easy way to get into a market and, to sort of put your toe in the water and see if it's going to work. But when you're ready to sort of go beyond that and look at expansion beyond just that one behemoth sales channel, you can look into other countries where Amazon doesn't exist yet. Go to Poland. Allegro, last I looked, gets more web traffic than Google or Facebook. It's worth going there. It's a good market if you can do it properly. So there's definitely that approach, and you have to consider the sort of localized country by country, region by region steps. But then if you're going sort of within Europe, so you gave the example of a French consumer coming to Germany. Germans typically are very marketplace / e-commerce friendly, but only recently it was also very cash is king society. So pre-COVID, I think COVID and Apple Pay are the two catalysts that finally got Germans away from using cash. But most Germans I know still have some cash tucked away under a mattress somewhere, because they're just, I don't know, it's a cultural thing. But Amazon and eBay are huge here. But the thing I love about the German market for e-commerce is that it's diversifying quickly. You've got Otto, who, you know, are one of Germany's oldest household brands, and also Karstadt and Galeria. These are sort of the kind of Macy's and I don't know, another American department store. They kind of merged recently, about 2 years ago, and they've formed their own marketplace now called Galeria DE. You've got Kaufland have recently purchased Real, which is, you know, these are two big supermarket chains, and that you're getting all these big local players throwing their hats in the marketplace game. So whereas in the UK, it's small startups like OnBuy taking on the giant Amazon, in Germany, you've got giants taking on Amazon. So it's really exciting to sort of see what's going on. And, you know, they're all going their own way. Otto's really focusing on digital and lots of advertising, lots of YouTube and voice advertising. Real just got purchased, so they're probably going to pivot. They're probably going to pivot again, but they've done some really exciting things. But again, if you're coming into Germany, you've got so many big opportunities to play with. Obviously, language, culture, things like that are big factors, but you've got so many opportunities to try and make money. It's just a case of figuring out where your resources are best dedicated.
Awesome. That's really good. Yeah. It's kind of funny. You made me think that's like a Godzilla fight. I kind of just want to sit back with some popcorn and watch the show, I guess. As someone in e-commerce, I'm like, oh, go ahead. I'll just watch. Cool. Okay. Thank you so much. Really quick, I wrote this down. I didn't forget. Well, first of all, thanks to you both. Now we're going to hear from, we're going to hear about my conversation with Lindsay McEwen he's the general manager from EMEA at Telium. So stay right here. Hi, everybody. Here I am, Sarah, catching up with Lindsay on the European report. Lindsay, would you like to introduce yourself from Telium and let us know what you do?
Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay McEwen. I'm the general manager of Telium here in Europe. We're an organization that help our customers get to grip with their customers' data so that they can talk to them in a way that's relevant, specific, timely, and interesting to them as a receiver of information from organizations. Great,
thank you. Okay, I'm just going to jump right into the questions. So first up, you already mentioned the word data. Anytime anyone uses the words big data, everyone's ears seem to perk up. So we know massive companies like Amazon are using big data amongst other technologies that we're probably unaware of. But how can mid-sized companies start using big data or just data in general in e-commerce, and what will help them with that specifically?
You know, data's not a new problem. It's not a big problem. It's not a small company problem. It's everyone's problem. And the analogy is as follows. In the retail setting, your local butcher who charges a slightly larger price point does so because he knows who you are. He knows what you buy. He understands your behaviors. There's some conversation as you turn up, as he asks about your dog or your cat or your daughter's first day at school. And there is a relationship. Now, whilst that's a one-to-one relationship, trying to ape that on a scalable format is incredibly hard. Even organizations, you mentioned Amazon are not particularly personal. They don't particularly predict your behaviors online and try and offer products based on how you look at their marketplace. Organizations across the board really need to think about not just big data, but the right data. Yeah. Because the right data drives the right relationship, means the right message happens with the right information at the right time.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Just because you have data, how many organizations have huge data projects, yet still email mediocre emails at scale to everybody? Yeah. It's not an excuse for mediocrity at scale. It's an opportunity for us to target messaging based on how people interact with our businesses. And that's essential in the modern economy. It's essential in the COVID economy. And it's essential as we blur the lines between experience and fulfillment online.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I feel that way with Amazon as well. It's not always as personal. And I love the line, big data is not an excuse for mediocrity. I like that. It's really clever. Okay, cool. Yeah. So it is true that apart from all these big technologies, companies and big data, what we're seeing as well is that Europeans are quite concerned about their data, specifically in some European countries. You look at Germany and France, they're very concerned about privacy and security. Can you give some advice to mid-sized companies when it comes to their data protection and privacy, and specifically in Europe, and maybe also some laws that you know of that people need to be aware of coming into Europe when it comes to data privacy and protection?
It's the juxtaposition of data. I want to be dealt with as an individual, but I don't want you to know who I am. That's a complex emotion. And you know what? I think that Europe has really tackled this very well. With the introduction of GDPR, we really wanted to help insulate consumers from bad use of data. Third-party data, selling lists, lookalike audiences, spamming on a scale that is randomization was a bad thing for the data industry. GDPR, thankfully, put together a process where there was a regulation and a regulator to manage businesses, find them, and put them in a position where they had to treat people's data with respect. However, that doesn't change our ability to use data to communicate with people. And you asked for me to give you some advice around how organizations can do this. Two things that I always say. Number one, transparency. It's important that you're open about what you collect, why you collect it, and what you're going to do with it. Too many organizations think big data is about collecting all data. Well, actually, you don't need to know everything about me to be personal to me. I've used this analogy before, Sarah. My name's Lindsay. In my country, that's a male and a female name. Just to understand my gender would be an interesting way to interact with me if you're selling me a gender-specific product. Secondly, it's the value exchange. How do I convince you through your onboarding into my organization that passing key kernels of data will result in my business treating you in a different way and giving you something valuable in riposte? And I think too many organizations forget this journey of data gathering versus the digital value exchange. Give me something and I'll give you something. Make sure that the way in which I interact with your organization is personal, and I'll feel more comfortable about you having more of my data. The point of it is, it's not a hyperpole. It's very difficult to figure out which parts of the data from a consumer's visit you want to keep and how to react to it. Organizations like Telium can help businesses really apply logic, common sense, and also some focus on how they deal from inbound data to talking to the consumer who provided that data. So make sure the process is seamless, make sure it's transparent, and for goodness sake, make sure at the end, the person providing you that data gets something valuable.
Yeah. That's great advice. I'm happy that you say that instead of me saying it or something. So when it comes to digital marketing in Europe, what must retailers consider when expanding into European countries with their marketing operations and strategies, would you say? So this is related to Telium, of course, but are there any differences or any specifics that you would give to retailers, particularly coming from outside the EU into the EU, or with the upcoming Brexit discussions, difficulties? Are there any pieces of advice you would give?
Well, you know what? Double opt-in is a tremendous challenge for marketers. Or is it? Does it mean that actually we're just sending relevant information to those who want to receive it? Or does it mean that we're no longer allowed to spam the entire country with non-personalized message about something that's not relevant to the receiver? You know, I always think a lot about opportunity cost in communication through the provision of personal data. A bad message is as impactful on people as a good message. Okay, getting a randomized comment when you haven't agreed to communicate with that organization can almost dissuade a buyer from ever visiting that organization again. So it's really important that organizations think about Germany, double opt-in, Holland, double opt-in, France, a real nationwide concern about being tracked on the internet. If you take a kind of open approach to all of these markets, not only can you get yourself in significant fiscal trouble, but more importantly, the reputational damage that you can do to your brand by running spam in these environments is incredibly impactful. So think about how you can actually gain that constant value exchange to get people to provide the double opt-in. Think about trusted relationships based on good data. Think about building a pipe between you and your consumers in a way that they want to receive content from you. It's amazing. My inbox from Google is festooned with hundreds of irrelevant emails, but every now and again there's a nugget in there. And I used an example on the last webinar I ran with you, Sarah, where I talked about a bike shop who are actually a direct-to-consumer business who have opened an experience store near me. And I wonder if that's what's going to happen to the future of retail, this blurring between the experience and the fulfillment. Mm-hmm. As I went into this bike store, I suddenly realized the only thing I could buy in there was maybe a t-shirt. I couldn't buy any one of the bikes that were beautifully displayed inside the organization, but I could touch and I could feel and I could ride them back and forth. And then someone came over to me who was not 19. He was an older, they obviously had somebody there who was a more experienced rider, who was a bit older, came to me and started to talk to me about how I like to mountain bike, what I like to do, where I rode, and my experiences. And it felt very unstructured. And then as I started to have the conversation, I thought, wait, he's gathering data from me. That's really interesting. And it doesn't feel like he's gathering data from me. As I left, I thought this should be interesting. I'm going to give you my email address. Let's see what happens. And for the first time, I saw a business actually send me a relevant communication in real time based on my conversation I'd had. So what it made me think about was, wow, that data gathering exercise did not feel like a data gathering exercise. Very important in places like France, Germany, and Holland, where people are very excited about keeping their personal data to themselves. I really felt like there was a value exchange. I felt that I got to do something for the provision of my personal data. And then when I left, I got a relevant, timely communication that meant when an email arrives from that organization now, I don't unsubscribe, I read it, I digest the content, and I will probably buy one of their products in the near term, because I felt as if the process of acquisition, communication, and ongoing fulfillment was soft and was based on a value exchange. So the cores in Europe don't change to anywhere else, but people are definitely more sensitive to the collection of data and the provision of communications off the back of it.
Yeah. And so with people being more sensitive, we're also, with the digital value exchange, I like that as well. There's also more and more regulation, it seems. And I think coming up soon is something with cookies. Something with cookies in Europe. I can't recall exactly what it is. Do you know about what I'm talking about?
Well, I think my marketers, or every marketer in the world, will be putting a massive hyperpole in front of it. It'll be a cookie apocalypse, or the
cookie apocalypse.
The cookie war. This is a really interesting comment. We're all worried about big data, but as the cookie disappears, are we just handing the curation of our customers to a large gentleman who stands outside the front of our store, let's call him Mr. G. Oogle, for example. And Mr. G. Oogle, he's the individual that allows people in and out of your store. He's the person who owns the relationship between them and you. He's an intermediary. He's actually stopping people from coming into your store because actually that store's not paying enough for Mr. G. Oogle's time. Now, as these large organizations continue to close the openness of these exchanges, then all we're going to be doing is moving the problem away. Imagine if you don't own your own customers. Imagine if you don't own your own customers' data. Imagine if you have to buy that data or pay for advertising in order to get access to that data. Imagine how out of control that's going to make us as retailers. Because you know what? I want my data collection to be done by my organization. And I want to be able to build that into my life cycle of how I deal with people as part of their transaction. I do not want to have to go to a single provider to get all of my customer information. This is kind of why we put GDPR in the first place anyway. It was to stop third parties owning our data sets and us having to go and acquire them from them. I'm concerned that big organizations are putting together a process that stops businesses owning their own relationship with their own customers. I don't want Mr. G. Oogle outside the front of my shop, only allowing people in if I tuck a 10 euro note into his top pocket.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I feel like moving forward.
No, then that feels like we're playing a game of Monopoly, as the Dutch call it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, and it sounds like that is detrimental to SMEs more than anything, actually, because they're the ones who also will struggle to afford to be able to do that.
Well, you know what? It's an interesting argument because actually, you know, when you look at the centralization of content, I think Facebook have done a phenomenal place in business with helping small businesses outreach to a global economy. I mean, there are brands that we're all experiencing because we've come through Facebook marketplaces or they're a position on Facebook. So I do think there is a place for it in our kind of societic approach towards marketing. I totally agree. You know, the butchers, I order black pudding and Scottish sausage from a butcher's in Stornoway in the north of Scotland, and I live in the southeast of England. I'm actually Scottish, and Scottish sausages are greatest in the world, as we all know. But I didn't find them because I'm a resident in Stornoway, which is an island in the Hebrides. I found them because I was put into a Facebook segment. I found these organizations who have really grasped this concept of internationalizing through an exchange. And what they do is they get me next day delivery on sausage and black pudding from Stornoway. I don't even know how I could get next day from Stornoway to my house, but hey, therein lies modern commerce. So I do think there is a place for it. However, as organizations grow, I think there is a place for them to own their own data set. And I think it's important for them to be able to reach out across their broad customer base and have a good personal relationship with end users.
Yeah. And one of the few ways they'll be able to compete with big players in e-commerce, it sounds like, as well. Yeah. We should do we're going to have to do a separate podcast called As the Cookie Crumbles or something. And then we're going to
yes.
some clever play on the words. Okay, Lindsay, we don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to ask if there's anything else that you wanted to share for retailers or companies in general looking to come into Europe. Is there any other tidbits or pieces of advice that you would give? Maybe it could be very applied, it could be very theoretical, whatever you would say.
You know, think about the person you're talking to is always that's the most important message I always give everybody. There is a horrible chain of events that is taking place across marketing where mass marketing only needs a small amount of it to convert for it to be worthwhile. That's just such horrible logic. Because let's send 25 billion emails out because actually we only need 45 people to buy. That opportunity cost thing that I thought about earlier is hugely impactful on businesses. What COVID has done to us all is found that a lot of us who are very passionate to in-store brands have now deserted them because their e-commerce approach is very different to their in-store brand, or completely different. We're a difficult bunch in Europe, mostly because there's lots of us. We're not the same. We don't all speak European, and we really don't have an equal culture that exists across all of our countries. You have to be specific. You have to deal with the country as a country in its own. The French like to buy from the French, and they like to buy from something that's sourced, created, manufactured, and provided, and helps the French economy. These are important things for you to think about as you come into the European marketplace. Lastly, but not least, it is not a data desert here in Europe. There are not millions and millions and millions of people who refuse to give you your data. We're just a little bit more sensitive with our privacy. We're a little bit more aware of people asking for data, and we've got a legacy of poor data management, hence the requirement to introduce GDPR. It's important that you bear that in mind when you come here. It's important that you bear in mind that the high street still exists here in Europe. If you look to other countries, people have moved towards conurbations of shopping centers. United States, I'm always amazed when I get taken to a great restaurant inside a shopping center. You just never would do that in Europe because the high street still plays a dominant feature. And there is still a personal relationship that we want to have with our retailers, even if it's a supermarket. Think about what you do, think about the countries you're going to, and think about the diversification of cultures that exist right across our glorious European conurbation. And yes, Brexit might cost us a problem, but actually most people realize what it means. We all want to be more French and more Italian, not more British.
I love it. Yeah, that's very true. I love the diversification part because there are also many American political refugees in Europe, speaking of myself. But well, thank you so much for joining me, Lindsay. I really appreciate it. I'm sure everybody appreciates your insights. And we'll talk to you soon, hopefully, on our next podcast. That's How the Cookie Crumbles, hopefully.
I look forward to it, Sarah.
Take care, Lindsay. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you again to my studio guests, Julia Bolaton and Jesse Ragg. Also thanks to Lindsay from Telium. If you didn't get a chance to check out the European report, you can download it with the link, retailx.net/Europe-2020. There it is. Yeah, it's free for retailers, which is awesome if you're watching this and you're a retailer. It's also free for Ecommerce Europe members. And maybe if you're a good friend of Jesse, you can email me. And if I'm feeling particularly generous, you can also get a free report. It just depends on if my fearless leader will allow that. Anyway, but so thanks for joining us. The UK webinar is tomorrow. Hopefully you check that out as well. And if you have any questions for myself or my amazing panelists, you can always send me an email and I will make sure they get it. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Sarah.
Bye.
Thank you.